Hello, my name is Carlos Hernandez, and this is my reading and reflection portfolio for English 1301 with Miss Elise. Over the past few weeks, we've been exploring what it means to be an active, engaged reader and writer, and this portfolio represents my journey so far. From someone who used to just skim through readings to someone who now understands what reading is and the strategic process behind it. Today, I'm going to walk you through the work I've selected, explain how I've engaged with key learning outcomes and writing practices, and share what I've discussed about myself as a student. This portfolio includes my annotated bibliography and our reading journal number 1, Critical Thinking in College Writing. Number 1, Critical Thinking. How I analyzed, evaluated, and questioned information. In my annotated bibliography, I demonstrated critical thinking by analyzing 5 different sources about reading and writing strategies. But I didn't just summarize what the author said. I evaluated how their ideas connected to each other and to my own development as a reader. For example, when I read Mike Bunn's How to Read Like a Writer, I had to evaluate whether his approach actually worked with what Dasbender said about critical thinking. I realized that both authors are essentially saying the same thing. Now we need to move beyond passive reading to active analysis. You can see this especially in my reflection, where I wrote that these texts have reshaped my thinking by framing research as an ongoing conversation where I must critically evaluate sources. That sentence shows I'm not just accepting information, I'm questioning it, how it all fits together, and what it means to be a writer. The Dasbender's reflection really pushed my critical thinking because I had to figure out what professors actually mean when they say use critical thinking. Before this, I thought it was just meant think harder, but now I understand it's about asking questions and connecting personal responses to academic analysis. Communication skills. How I adapted my writing for different audiences and purposes. Communication skills showed up differently across my assignments. In the annotated bibliography, I had to write for an academic audience using formal conventions. Thesis statements, properly formatted citations, and analytical language that explain not just what sources say, but how they matter. In my process of reflection, I could be more personal and honest. I wrote things like I heavily did, skim reading, and that say does felt for me personally the most helpful. This is more conversational language because the purpose was different. I was reflecting on my actual learning process, not presenting formal research. This taught me that good communication isn't about always sounding academic. It's about matching your language and your tone to your purpose and audience. When I'm introducing sources in my bibliography, I use phrases like this frame argues that the credibility of an information source is not innate, but it is constructed by communities. But when I'm reflecting on my process, I can say I wanted to figure out how to apply it in my own day-to-day writing and the assignments that we do in class. Teamwork. How I collaborated and respected diverse perspectives. Teamwork happened during our annotation activities and peer discussions about the reading. When we worked on annotating text together, I learned different strategies from my classmates that I hadn't considered before. One moment that stands during our discussion of the authorities constructed on contextual frame, someone in class pointed out that Noah pointed out that this means Wikipedia might actually be credible for some purposes, even though we're always told not to use it. That completely changed how I thought about evaluating sources, because I had always thought Wikipedia was not a credible source. Instead of just following rules about what's good or bad, I started thinking about context. What am I using this source for? Who's my audience? This collaboration also showed up when we shared our annotation strategies. I mentioned in my reflection that says and does annotations were most helpful for me, but other students prefer different approaches. This diversity of perspectives taught me that there's no single right way to read. We each develop strategies that work for our own individual learning styles, and sharing those strategies makes us all stronger readers in the long run. Personal responsibility. How I made ethical choices and connected actions to consequences. Personal responsibility meant being honest about my weaknesses and taking ownership of my learning. In my process of reflection, I admitted that I heavily did skim readings before this class. That's a vulnerable thing to admit, but it was important for my growth. I also demonstrated personal responsibility by actually completing the annotations thoughtfully instead of just rushing through them. When I wrote that annotation strategies helped me slow down and really think about what the author was saying rather than just skimming. I was acknowledging that I had a choice. I could have kept skimming like I used to, but I chose to engage more deeply and put myself in the reading to make it harder for myself. Another example was when I was working on my annotated bibliography, I had to ethically represent each author's ideas. I couldn't just cherry pick quotes that supported what I wanted to say. I had to fairly summarize their arguments. You can see this in how I described Dasbender's point that critical thinking is not about being negative, but about asking questions. Sorry about that. Analyzing ideas and connecting experiences with academic work. I represented her full argument, not just the parts that I liked. Writing behaviors and practices. Writing strategies I developed for approaching reading and writing tasks. My reading process completely transformed through these assignments. Before, my strategy was basically to just skim and hope I got the main idea. Now I have an actual toolkit. For the Dasbender reading, I use specific strategies, paraphrasing key points, noticing text organization, and writing down my reactions. As I wrote in my reflection, these strategies helped me slow down and really think about what the author was really saying, rather than just skimming. But here's what's interesting. I also learned that not all strategies work equally well for every text or every purpose. The Say's Does annotations were most helpful for understanding arguments, while genre convention notes didn't help me as much with comprehension. This taught me that part of being a strategic reader is choosing the right tool for the job. For my annotated bibliography, I had to read 5 different sources and figure out how they connected. I developed a process where I'd read one for understanding, then go back and annotate for connections between texts. Then draft my entries, focus on how each source contributed to my overall thesis about reading and writing strategies. Revision. How I saw, evaluated, and used feedback. The title of my annotated bibliography says Draft 1, which tells you I understand this was a work in progress, not a finished product. I was preparing to revise based on feedback. One specific example revision in my original draft of the Dasbender annotation, I focused too much on summary. When I received feedback, either from peer review or self-assessment, I realized I needed to add more evaluation. That's why my final version includes not just what Dasbender says, but what I think about it. A few ideas that stood out to me were how critical thinking is a process that connects personal responses to academic writing. I also had to make critical decisions about which feedback to prioritize. For instance, if someone suggested I needed more summary about another person that said I needed more analysis, I had to evaluate which advice aligned better with the assignment goals. Since the assignment asked for annotation, which means summary plus evaluation, I knew I needed to prioritize the feedback about adding more of my own thinking. The process of reflection itself is a form of self-feedback by asking myself which annotations were most helpful and least helpful. I was evaluating my own work and making decisions about what strategies to keep using and what to modify. Rhetorical awareness. How I made strategic choices about audience, purpose, and genre. Rhetorical awareness means understanding that writing does not happen in vacuum. It's always for someone, for some purpose, in some form. In my bibliography introduction, I made specific rhetorical choices. I wrote, my thesis is that effective reading, writing, and research are skills developed through intentional strategies, critical analysis, and understanding of information's context. And writer's awareness of craft. This is very formal academic language because my audience is my professor, and my purpose is to demonstrate scholarly thinking. But look at the difference in my process of reflection. When I wrote, my purpose for reading this essay was to understand what professors really mean when they say use critical thinking in assignments. I'm using more conversational language. Why? Because the purpose is different. I am reflecting on my own learning process, and that calls for a more personal, honest tone. I also demonstrated rhetorical awareness by following the conventions of an annotated bibliography, citation, summary, evaluation, and reflection for each source. I understand that researchers expect these elements in each genre, so I made sure to include them. Key point: how I researched, evaluated sources, and contributed to conversations. This portfolio really showcases my growth in understanding what research actually is. I used to think research was just finding sources that said what I wanted them to say. Now I understand it about entering the conversation. My annotated bibliography thesis shows a shift. I'm exploring how multiple texts collectively provide a framework for becoming more engaged and critical participant in academic conversations. I apologize for the dog barking if you can hear it. I'm not just collecting information, I'm seeing how scholars talk to each other about reading and writing. The authoritative, constructive, and conceptual frame was huge for me. It taught me that credibility isn't about following rules, like never use Wikipedia. Instead, I need to evaluate sources based on context. Who created this? For what purpose? What do I need it for? This is a much more sophisticated approach to information literacy. What these experiences taught